Hi, welcome and good morning or good afternoon, good day to you. I trust that everybody's well and you can see my screen. And welcome to this webinar, Preparing for a Rise with SAP Negotiation. I'm sure there are many organizations and of you who are working in organizations out there that are interested in finding out how best to get your negotiation on track with regards to SAP RISE. And this session is really to talk about that in a little bit more detail. So it's great to have you on board today. Please be aware we are recording the session. We will share the slides with you later as well as the recording. And if you do have any questions, please pop them in the questions bar for us. We'd love to answer those. It's great to have an interactive session with people in the audience, and I'm sure there are questions. There's lots of things that are happening in the SAP space and lots of changes that have taken place recently. So always be aware that we at VOQUZ Labs try to bring you the latest and most up-to-date content with regards to changes that are taking place in the SAP environment. And I think without further ado, let's kick this off, and looking forward to the session with you all. Right, let's check that this goes on. So pretty much when we talk about getting ready for negotiation, one of the things that you need to be aware of, and this is out of Harvard's Business Review from 2020, you can see that there are 5 main areas that you should be aware of and be using as tools to negotiate. And these are counterparts, constituencies, scope, precedence, and timing. Now, we're not going to focus on the counterparts and constituency side of things in this session because they're pretty much self-explanatory. When you think about counterparts, you think about who you're going to be negotiating with. In the SAP world, that's normally your account executive. And where do you stand from a constituency perspective? I'm not going to go into a whole lot of details about constituencies. But here you can certainly see we're going to focus on the areas of scope, precedence, and timing. And that's really going to be our focus areas because we need to determine the scope from a negotiation perspective and understand exactly what's happening in the scope of your negotiation of RISE. And we're going to talk about what you need to do from a precedence perspective. And then we're going to look at the timing of things. So really important to understand those 3 elements are probably the most important elements, and we want to speak about those in the session. So that's what that's just been highlighted there: scope, precedence, and timing. So what does the scope entail when you look at a RISE contract? So first of all, the biggest difference that you're going to notice when you go to RISE is that it is a single contract as compared to your ECC contract and other SAP contracts that you may have signed in the past, that you may have had in the past, and all of a sudden SAP is bundling everything that they have from a license perspective, from an infrastructure, and from an infrastructure services management perspective into one contract. So this is really a bundle that you're going to get. It's in one contract, and you need to be aware of that single contract now. And that really is a very significant difference to where most organizations are coming from. Why do I say it so significantly? Because you now have to consolidate multiple other contracts that you had and literally bundle them all into one, and you have to apply that across these 3 different areas. So when we look at this, let me give you an example of the different contract dimensions. This is just an example that we pull out from a dashboard perspective. You can see in here, this really details and determines the different contract dimensions that you would need to look at in order for you to understand you're moving from this type of contract dimensions. You've got different engines in use, distinct license types. You may have a whole lot of different contract user types and contracts against these that you've purchased over time. You've got different products, maybe some of them in shelfware. You've got different maintenance fees by product group, etc. And you've got a yearly maintenance and a maintenance base. This is really important because you need to decompose your entire contract and understand all the working parts of your existing contract before you can move to this one RISE contract. And this is the vital part of it in terms of the determining and the determination of the scope that goes into a specific RISE contract. So these are some of the elements. I'm sure there are many more in this context. Whoops, sorry, let me just jump back to the slides here. It's going to jump out of there. I just want to go to the next slide if I can. Push the slide here. Right, so the real scope within the RISE scoping contract is the following. So you have SAP licenses. Right at the top, you need to determine the real demand for the SAP licenses that you have. And this is specifically in your user licenses, the named user licenses. You need to determine the actual usage of your user licenses, because you're going to be moving those, and I'll show you some slides further on. You're going to be moving those into a FUE type of things, full user equivalence on S4HANA. So you really need to understand the determination of your ECC licenses. You need to understand the real determination and demand that you have on your engines. Are there changes in those, in the engine sizing? Are there changes in your digital access, etc.? So you need to do a very detailed determination on the demand that you have and the usage that you actually use across your license landscape. You then need to determine the infrastructure, the sizing, and the flexibility of that infrastructure. So when we talk about flexibility, there are different programs that SAP are using from a flexibility perspective around CPEA, the Cloud Platform Enterprise Agreement. Are you going to take pay as you go? Are you going to do subscription, etc.? So there's different flexible options from a costing perspective that you need to be aware of. And also you need to right size your infrastructure, the database sizing, the cloud structure that you're going to have. What is that right sizing? Then thirdly, you need to look at the infrastructure management, the SLA. So SAP have put together the SLA, and you need to determine the parameters of that SLA and understand what type of support you're going to be gaining from that SLA, as compared to if you had to do an S4HANA solution on your own hyperscaler. So you need to do that comparison. So if you're taking a hyperscaler, and there's a whole lot of out there, or your own data center, a cloud data center. So whether it's on Microsoft, Google, Amazon, or Alibaba, or whichever data center you're actually using from a cloud perspective, you need to compare the SLA that they would be providing as a hyperscaler infrastructure service provider versus what you're going to get from the SAP side. And then you need to determine, as part of the real scope of this exercise for your organization, the migration itself. So how much is that migration going to cost? What type of migration are you actually going to plan to do? So are you actually going to go and do a bit of a brownfields and you're just going to take data across? Or are you going to do a greenfields, totally change all the business processes? Are you moving from ECC? It very much depends on your starting point. And the costs of those and the duration of those are very much determined on whether you've moved from ECC to S4HANA, or if you've moved from S4HANA to a RISE contract. There are multiple different costs and durations that you need to consider. And those costs need to come into the actual scoping of your project. And then, of course, you need to look at the prices of the different products that you have and the discounting tiers against each one of those products. And I'll show you an example of that shortly, to determine what is your negotiation strategy related to the discount tiers. And the reason why we need to understand this as an organization is that you need to work out which is the largest volume of product that's purchased from a cost perspective, and on that discount, that's where you want to get your discount tiers. Secondly, when you look at some of the factors in terms of the products, you may have the, as we call it, the Christmas tree effect, where if you move slightly over a discount tier, you get a better pricing. So instead of having 100 licenses in a certain area, you move to 110, and your price actually ends up being lower than if you had 99 or 100. Okay, so that's really important to understand what is the tier discounts and how can you apply them to the actual product set that you have within your organization. And then, of course, your migration plan. How long have you been on ECC? How much ABAP coding, how much transformation do you need to make with relation to your ECC? So if you have been on ECC for a number of years, obviously you have a lot of functionality in the ECC system that you need to manage and be aware of, and you need to plan how and if that functionality is still needed, and are you going to bring over some of that and recode some of that functionality into S4HANA on RISE? How are you going to manage that? And if you plan to do that, so as soon as you think about the migration plan, then you need to also bring into the context the business technology platform. And you'd say, okay, if I'm going to add additional services in the analytics space, in the data space, in the IoT space, and SAP are pushing us towards this intelligent enterprise, then I also need to plan in how I'm going to utilize the BTP that SAP are putting underneath as an infrastructure development operations layer, and how I'm going to utilize the services within that to continue ensuring that the application functionality that I had on ECC is going to meet my business requirements and the business model that we have within the organization. So that is very much determining in terms of that plan and how long you've been on ECC for. And then of course we need to look at the contract. Okay, your contract is fundamental. It is the foundation point from which you're now going to build the application layer, the licensing construct, etc. The terms and conditions. What trade-ins am I available to take over the period of time that I go into a RISE contract? Can I trade things in? If I find they're not working, if I find that functionality in the new S/4HANA system is not meeting my business requirements, what trade-in options do I have? And existingly on ECC, what shelfware can I repurpose and trade in? So very important, you need to determine that which you're not using in your current ECC system and put into the contract terms and conditions that are favorable for yourselves, that allow you to do trade-ins when the functionality is not working in the context of your business model. And then the return on investment, you have to work out a true total cost of ownership. And I've done a number of sessions around total cost of ownership, the importance of doing a total cost of ownership. What savings are you going to achieve, if any, by going through this process? Okay, and what additional revenue will I get out of this? So will I generate additional revenue from implementing a certain set of functionality? I might add new functionality that wasn't available that brings in a new revenue stream. I might bring on different business models inside of my existing business. How can that be of benefit to us as an organization? At the same time, offsetting the savings of moving to S/4HANA. So please be aware of that. And I think that's really important to look at those. These aspects, as I've indicated here, these 7-8 aspects here, these really make up the scope of what you need to determine when looking at RISE with an SAP perspective. And here again, I'm just giving you some examples of a determination of when you want to look at the costing, and I'm doing it by license type to see where you would actually have your greatest amount of discount applicable. So in this case, we're saying, oh, well, maybe I should really look at, this is an industry solution, utilities. Maybe I should look in that context and see, okay, that's where I should really apply for the biggest amount of discounts. The same for users, okay, because here I can see by product group the volume that I'm actually utilizing and the maintenance fees I'm paying on that. Okay, so different products in the contract itself, the contracts, you can see most organizations may have a significant number of contracts. Okay, so examples of how does this work, and it's really important. This slide is fundamental. You need to be able to extract the information from your current ECC system in a way that is representative, that you can start making informed decisions around how you're going to negotiate your RISE contract. Okay, and then of course, what's really important in the context of determining your RISE negotiation is to build various scenarios and compare the different options. So I don't have to spend too much time on this slide. I'm going to go straight into another example. Okay, so S/4HANA cost scenarios, determining the components, okay, and doing a cost comparison. Okay, this is really nice, easy dashboard. We help organizations put these dashboards together in order to determine the comparisons. Okay, so you can see an OPEX in 2021 versus an OPEX in 2022 from different product sets, the quantities of those, the subscriptions of those. If you're going to move even off an S/4HANA side and move to a RISE contract, you need to determine how much money you're going to be spending in your new contract, okay? And where does this change come from? Where are the values that are increasing your cost of ownership of your SAP system? Where are they coming from? what is generating those additional costs. Okay, so very important. I think for most organizations, we really encourage you to make sure that you do this determination and this cost comparison as accurately as possible. We have services that enable that, and we'll talk about them a little bit later in the system, but in this presentation. But please, this is some examples of how we actually do that in the presentation of the information around this. I'm just going to quickly pause for a second. I just want to just check if there are any questions in the actual tab section. So I just want to see if there are any questions. If anybody's got some questions, please pop them in there. Okay, I'm not seeing any questions, so we'll continue with the presentation itself here. Okay, and then we're talking about the precedent. So we've looked at the scope elements of RISE and the things that you need to determine from a scope perspective. Then the precedents, what precedents are being set in terms of RISE. So first of all, if you determine that there's going to be a multi-year contract, okay, you need to determine that these must be linked to higher discounts. So if you take a 3-year or 1-year, 3 or 5-year contract, the higher you go in terms of the length of contract, that should be linked to a higher discount value. Okay, that's really important to understand. So be aware from a precedent perspective, you need to have this precedent set up right up front. Okay. Secondly, the next, and I'll see there's a question coming through then, I'll get to that shortly. The right to trade in licensure should be included in your contract. Okay. So when you start thinking about how we're going to negotiate, the first step, multi-year contracts linked to a high discount. Secondly, trade-in licenses should be included in the contract. Make sure that you negotiate that point in the context of your discussions with SAP. Okay. All right. And then prices, thirdly, prices can usually be fixed for a limited time period. Okay. So if you have a set of flexible pricing, you can normally fix that for the time period that you're on. It might be linked to a certain set of revenue metrics. It might be an engine-based metric, etc. So be aware that you should go into the negotiation understanding which of those metrics should be fixed and which prices can be fixed. Okay. And then thirdly, your digital access from an SAP perspective may be used to put pressure on you to move to the RISE contract. Please be aware that there are different scenarios from a digital access side, and we do multiple different digital access projects to help organizations understand the right digital access approach to take. So whether they should stay on legacy or move to the digital document model, and what the cost of moving there is. Okay, with a DAAP program that's still running this year, it's been running for a number of years now. We don't know, we're almost halfway through the year, whether SAP will extend it again. Unlikely, but there is always that possibility. So I think these are the key precedents that you should take into consideration when you determine that negotiation. Okay, let's just have a quick look at a question here. Yes, we will get a recording of this session. Okay, there's some questions around maintenance. So let me just talk about maintenance. On ECC, when you had a maintenance agreement, when you move to a subscription, that maintenance agreement is already pre-built into your subscription. So definitely, and it's definitely something you should be aware of. It's not a difference to that. I'm just quickly reading this other question here. Yeah, of course, permanent price increases are definitely not in the course of the customer interest. I think, let me also clarify this one here as well. It's important to understand. Within the CPEA documentation, the terms of conditions of that, there is a clause that SAP have put in there that they may adjust the pricing on the CPEA. So be aware of that. At any time, SAP can suddenly say, well, we're going to increase the costing of this. Now, if you're not, you should just, I want to highlight that to you. So that, I think, is the important question there. Can the subscription rate be fixed? Well, you need to negotiate that with SAP. Okay, that's something that you should definitely be aware of. Look at the terms and conditions of the CPE agreement and have a look and see where those those elements can be fixed for the time period that you're on that subscription. So again, that would bring it back in line with what you have from a maintenance perspective, and that would give you a like for like in the context of that. So yeah, some good questions coming through here. I hope I'm answering those. And what we will also do is, if I don't get to all the questions during this webinar session, I think what's important is we'll also answer them afterwards and send out the answers to everybody. So we'll add some extra information to the answers that I've already provided. It's great to have you asking questions. It always helps us to get some context around this, etc. Okay, digital access, is it mandatory in RISE with SAP, or can we have our bring your own license? Again, this is something that SAP have always had in their licensing model, this indirect licensing. They've said anything that touches the SAP core and does interactions with SAP core, this needs to be licensed. Now, how you license that, I think, is really the important perspective. You can stay on an existing named user license basis and have that as your basis. Remember, in some contexts, the sales service order engine falls away, and SAP are trying to take that out the way and rather convert that into your digital access and digital document side of things. But please be aware, you need to go and negotiate this with SAP. But in order to do that, you need to determine financially from a digital access perspective, which is the best model for you, a legacy model or a digital documents model. And that's really the fundamental that you need to understand in this context from a business perspective. Okay, let's close up the questions for a second, and I'll come back to them shortly. I see that there's a hand up in here. If there is a question and things like that, please pop it in the questions bar. It's great. I can then answer those questions, and it's much easier to do so in this context. So just pop those questions in there, and we can continue with that. Good. So let's just have a look at some financial scenarios as examples, okay? When you look at a RISE with SAP, I think this is so fundamental. Okay, please understand, we've looked at this in terms of the user costs from a named user basis, from an S4HANA versus a RISE. So you'll see here in the slide, okay, here you have two different types of clients. This is a production client on the left-hand side, and this is a financial client on the right-hand side. What do we see in this graphical representation? First of all, the blue line represents your S4HANA perpetual license. You'll see it starts off at around about 2 million euros on this side here. And when you start off with the RISE with SAP, when you've actually converted those S4HANA perpetual user licenses into full user equivalents, and you can see the calculation on the right-hand side in this little table over here. You've got your RISE developer, your RISE advanced, your RISE core, and your RISE self-service. You start off in RISE at a lower cost base, but over time, this RISE actually increases. So while you may start lower, the end point and the tipping point of where that change, the inflection point, is about 4 to 5 years in, where you actually start paying more from a RISE perspective. So if you add the infrastructure surprise of 30%, then you're actually going to start paying more over time for this. So be aware, this is on the production clients, okay, and that's normally 4.5 years. In the financial client services, okay, this is actually greater. And why is that? Because you need to have additional users in the advanced space as compared to your production client, who only needs a fewer users as an advanced user. Okay, you can see the difference in the numbers, 377 to 900 and 550 to 220. Okay, so in production use cases, you have way more self-service users as compared to financial clients, banks, etc. So in this case, moving to a RISE contract, you are going to make that inflection point at a much earlier stage, okay, and your costs are going to be higher from an infrastructure perspective by 49%. So very importantly, please do, let us help you do this modeling in terms of the total cost of ownership, so that you have a very clear and a very informed sense of information from which to decide which way to go onto. Not necessarily it may look cheaper at the beginning, but over time it's going to become more expensive. So you've got to put into consideration these future costs and the determination of those future costs. Okay, let's move to the next slide here. So you must take into consideration from a costing perspective in terms of the scenario that you need to build, your maintenance ECC, let's call it X. You need to look at what your user optimization is. So have you actually optimized your users? Do you have a surplus set of named users? Very important. We find in all the projects that we do with customers, we find that most customers are in a position where they have, up to 60% user surplus. Okay, they're just not allocating from a roles perspective, from an authorizations perspective. There's too many moving parts to get user optimization correct manually. It just doesn't work. Okay, there's way too many transaction sets. There's way too many data points to try and do this manually. So do a user optimization using a software asset management tool. Then you need to look at the shelfware cancellations. These are the things that you're gonna reduce on. Okay, then you're gonna add stuff on regularizations. Okay, where you have to regularize things in terms of your business models, in terms of your process models, in terms of the functionality that you have. Okay, you might have multiple businesses that you need to regularize this over. You may have to add additional products in, and then you can also take off your perpetual certain licenses from a trade-in from a software perspective. Okay, so that equals a subscription on RISE, which is the cost of Y, and this is what we're comparing, the X and the Y together. So what are the pieces from a scenario perspective that go into these elements? And let's just check. There are some questions here, I see. Let me try and pick up from where we left off. That's a very easy one. How is the SAP license model designed? Look, there are lots of documentation around the design of the license model. Let me just quickly talk about it. There's the contract at the foundational layer, and then you've got 4 different pillars, really. You've got named user licenses, you've got engines, you've got your databases, and you've got your digital access. Those are the 4 main pillars of how a construct of SAP license types is designed. Now, within that construct, you either have an on-premise, you have a cloud subscription, and you have a RISE, which is really what we're talking about today. I hope that just summarizes it very quickly. Yes, involving the hardware costs are very important. It does mean you have to maintain an account. Okay, so I'll answer that a bit more. RISE licenses include HANA database. So yes, definitely. The HANA database side is very important in terms of determining how much cost you need to pay. Okay, so as I said, that license construct, one of the pillars of the license construct is the database element. Okay, so you need to determine how much costing you're paying from a database perspective. And in our calculations, we do a database analysis and determine what you're going to pay from a subscription of the database side. What's also important that we found out with other customers and with customers who have gone through this process and reached out to us is that when they move from an on-premise to a cloud solution perspective, some of the things that they don't take into consideration is availability of data sets or data tables, and they start pumping all this high availability onto data and ensuring that they have all this high availability. But with that high availability comes great cost. And all of a sudden, boom, they get hit with a very large bill from a subscription perspective because they're sitting with their infrastructure on high availability. So be aware of that. That's something that's really something that can trip you up as an organization, understanding what you need from your data perspective that needs to be highly in the high availability side. A lot of cases, you don't need certain data sets to be high available, and that can really save you money. Okay. Can we remove CRM and add professional LIC during AMC? I'll have to get back to you on that one. That's a very specific question. I think it's important we'll take some of those questions offline, etc. Okay. So does the RISE contract compare favorably from a price point to the hyperscaler pricing? At this point in time, we're doing some analyses with customers around what that pricing would be, and certainly I can reach out to you and share that with you individually. I think that's an important element to share. because there are definitely differences there. The other thing that we see is that you have, from a hyperscaler perspective, in terms of your interaction directly, you may have an existing very strong relationship with one of the hyperscalers. Now, when you move to RISE, you tend to lose that relationship because, one, everything is now bundled with SAP and you have to go to SAP to resolve any issues. The other side that you must also just be aware of is that within certain of the hyperscalers, they have additional functionality sets, okay, that you may not be able to get through the RISE contract. So you may actually be in a negative position if you're using certain of the hyperscalers enabled functionality, okay, and now you suddenly you take that away. So be aware, what are you getting from your hyperscaler? We need to analyze that and actually bring that into context of the scope that you're looking through. Okay. Okay, I'm not going to answer the things about skill sets and RISE with SAP and ABAP skill sets, etc. I think there is also a lot of discussion that we see in the marketplace around, will I, as an SAP organization, reduce my ABAP and development load because I'm moving everything into the cloud? No, not necessarily. You will still need to have at least a set of developers that will work potentially in the BTP space on ensuring that you have the right applications in your SAP and in your application landscape in order to deliver the business requirements that you have and to enable the business. Okay. What are the main advantages of RISE with SAP on public cloud and private cloud? Okay, for many organizations, they see it, the move is simpler. They're working with one contract. They can consolidate everything. They only have one organization to deal with when they're looking at infrastructure, etc. They don't have to have multiple contracts. So there are benefits in that context, but from a costing perspective, you need to weigh that up. Okay. Okay, I'll send out some information. Let's just go back into the presentation set as well here, and let's continue with this at the moment. Right, let me click on here. Right, the return on investment of RISE, okay. I think this is also a very important thing when you look at negotiating a RISE contract. Will you have reduced overall costs? So software and infrastructure costs. Again, you need to combine the two of them. You can't just say, okay, we're going to look at the application side. As I mentioned earlier, you do have to do a detailed analysis of your database, of what you were paying on the HANA database side. If you were on an S4HANA side, if you were on an ECC, you might be on an Oracle DB, you might be on IBM DBs, you may be on different databases. You need to take the cost of those databases into consideration in order to determine whether my cost is actually going to be reduced. And then you also need to add to this whether or not I'm going to have added business value. Okay, so am I going to be able to create additional business revenue with reduced cost and reduced assets? So by not having a whole lot of data, databases and servers to look after, all that comes with it, will I be able to reduce my cost? And at the same time, is there additional functionality that is going to enable my business to grow? Because that's what you're in business for. You want your business to grow. From a revenue perspective, you want to grow the revenue and make more profit. That's fundamentally what business is about. So how can I use additional functionality, and where do I find that functionality that's going to support my businesses to grow revenues? All right. And do I have a reduction in the volume of risks? Okay. There's some examples here: out of stock, bill to cash, procure to pay. Will these processes that I have, will there be a greater degree of standardization? Will I reduce is there a reduction in functionality? Is the functionality the same as what I've got today? So these are elements that you need to look at. The other thing that I often speak to customers about and have engagements with customers around is the role model changes. Okay, when you move to a cloud-based solution on S4HANA, okay, you need to understand that you need to extend the roles, the authorizations. These are risks, the segregation of duty risks, etc. So will we reduce those? Will we enhance that? What will happen to our roles when we go to an S4HANA context? How will we manage that? So some ideas around the return of investment. So if you're going to go down the RISE, these are the things you need to look at. Okay, timing, the last portion of what we've spoken about is the timing aspect. Okay, and I think these are considerations that you need to take to sit down from an internal perspective within your organization as the procurement team, as the software asset management team, as the IT infrastructure team. You need to get the right players around the table and say, okay, from a timing perspective, when is our best time from a negotiation perspective? Okay, SAP's end of year business, everybody knows it, 31st December. I worked in the SAP environment for a number of years, and of course, there's a hockey stick effect, they used to call it. So you want to get as many sales in at the end of the year. So that's a driver from a timing perspective around when you negotiate. Okay. I think important there, you'll see you can't negotiate special terms and conditions on the 28th of December. You just can't start doing that. It's just not feasible. So our encouragement to clients is to start that negotiation at the right timing. Make sure that you have all the pieces of the puzzle in front of you and have done your total cost of ownership, the scoping, all the things I've spoken about. Have that in place to start a proper negotiation. Okay. Important element here, what you get today in a proposal will, as well as will it be attainable tomorrow? Okay, so will you be able to get the same context out of what you have now in your current functionality set? Okay, that's changed from a proposal perspective. Will you be able to gain it in terms of actually implementing it? Okay. And then we're saying don't start preparing in only September. Maybe there's some time that you, depending on the size of your organization, you may need to start preparing earlier. Okay, you need to maybe start with user analysis and things like that earlier. So I think that's really important. Let's pause it here for a second. I think while we're on timing, and it's a good time to open the questions panel again. Let's see there what other questions have come in. Okay, so there's a question around, there's a question on regularization. I'll come back to that one. I think it's important. I'll just answer that one in an email back to you. New developments done on BTP and with RISE, how will RISE integrate with this? So just understand that within the structure of what SAP calls the intelligent enterprise, BTP is now a technology platform that allows you and enables you to build certain applications, enhance applications, do elements regarding analysis and data from a perspective within the cloud. Okay, so they are cloud-based functionality, etc., that enables that. So definitely, from what we're seeing, and we are going to do a session on BTP and the licensing model around BTP shortly, because it's a very key area, and lots of organizations are struggling to understand the different licensing models within BTP, etc. But I certainly think you cannot go into a RISE negotiation without the consideration of BTP. You need to understand the different services that you have available within that. So I would encourage all of you to go and have a look at that. Look at the costings that you can get out of that. And that, as I said earlier, that needs to be brought in to the overall consolidation of costing that you're going to have against where you currently are. So you need to understand you may be employing a certain number of ABABers, developers, etc., to do a certain amount of work. You may now have certain sets of those people individually working in the BTP space in order to fulfill those business requirements in a configuration perspective and in a development perspective. So just be aware that's the context of it. It wasn't there in the past. Well, let me say it wasn't there. It was there in the past, but in different ways. So you still had, you know, if you move to a software analytics cloud, that used to be BIBO. So yes, it used to be an on-premise solution and you used to have a BIBO development, and now it's a software analytics cloud that you're on. So yes, you're comparing the apples for apples then. Okay, so these are some of the contexts that happen at the lower level of granularity that you really need to extract out, as I say, decompose it, so that you can recompose the right contract structure in your RISE contract discussions with SAP. Okay, so just let's have a look at the costs and the different elements within a RISE contract. So normally your costs from a standard perspective, when you have them standardized, you have year 1, year 2, year 3, you can see that they're all level at the top, okay? When you go to a pay-as-you-go model, okay, as you increase your functionality, and as it's similar to having like a mobile phone contract, as you take more services on, you start increasing the cost of that. So while your year 1 may, from a costing perspective, may be significantly less than your standard at year 1, year 2 starts to grow, and year 3 may be higher. So you need to work out again from a total cost of ownership model. If you're in the RISE space and you go on a pay-as-you-go perspective, then you're going to have an increase in cost in year 3. You may want to average that out, but again, start taking that to year 4, year 5, etc. Okay. If you have a multi-year agreement, again, similar to a standardized cost, again, you may get a greater discount level as compared to your standard costs for 1 year when you have a multi-year deal. So again, look at the different options that are available that SAP have in terms of their costing models and determine, and we can help you with this, which is the best fit for your organization. What makes sense for you from an organizational perspective? I think that's really important to understand the different costing models. Okay. And then the different options available to you. Okay. So as I have said right the way through, SAP ECC, IS services and on an own data center versus RISE with SAP contract, an all-in-one contract, versus S/4HANA on-prem with IS services on a hyperscaler. Okay, so these are the 3 different options you have available to you. Okay, when you start off on any of these 3, you need to consider, as you see on the right-hand side here, the new contract. Okay, what will be considered in the new contract, the SAP migration cost, the infrastructure migration. Okay, there's definitely infrastructure migration. Let me just talk a little bit about this in some context. Some customers, and we've seen it in terms of their migration approach to S/4HANA, either on a RISE contract or not on a RISE contract, some of them have decided that the existing SAP ECC system ends up being a legacy system. They keep all their relevant sets of data in their legacy SAP ECC. They then determine that they're going to maintain that from a legal perspective for the number of years that they need to maintain it for, whether it's 5, 10, whatever the country's specific legal requirements are on data maintenance. And they only move over certain transactional data elements and they start a totally new greenfields approach. If that was your migration strategy and your scenario that you took, you would then need to build in the cost of running the existing infrastructure to maintain a set of SAP data in the ECC legacy system. So therefore, you're maintaining a cost of your infrastructure, your databases, whether they're HANA, whether they're Oracle, whatever databases you've got to maintain those. Plus, you've got to add to that the new costs of either you're on, well, in this case, you're not going to go onto an on-premise again, you're going to go to the cloud, your new infrastructure costs. So it's really important that people don't lose sight of the fact that there is potentially an existing data set that needs to be managed and maintained if you're not taking everything over. If you have this very greenfields approach, then certainly you're going to need to build that cost in. And that's why I say the IS migration costs are really important. You need to understand those. You also need to understand any interfaces and API migrations to your third-party systems. So build that into your costing model, okay? You were having all these APIs and all this integration in an application landscape that was on-premise, that was in your own data centers, etc. All of a sudden, that's now moved off-site, that's on cloud, it's in a contract with RISE, or it's on S/4HANA cloud on a hyperscaler. How are you going to change those APIs and those migration interfaces, okay? You need to make sure you have software resolution. So when you go into your options, make sure you understand what software you have, make sure you do a user optimization, resolve the digital access, very important, and do a business case evaluation. So these are the fundamental elements from an options perspective. So apply that which is on the right-hand side, apply these principles to each of these elements, these 3 options, and that will give you a determination of which is the best way to go. Okay. There is a question coming in. I see that. I'll come to that shortly. So again, there's lots of moving parts in this space. There's lots. You cannot just go into it with a concept saying, okay, RISE is the best way to go. You definitely need to do your homework. We can't stress it enough. If you decide to go to a RISE with SAP all-in-one contract and suddenly your costs are way higher, there can potentially be somewhere where you missed one of these elements and you didn't necessarily resolve it. So please, we're encouraging you to get these things right in the way in which we're going to negotiate with SAP. So let me just go to the questions. Let me go one back quickly and let's go and answer a question. We have a few minutes left. So infrastructure migration, let me just clarify that. Yes, infrastructure migration, definitely, as I said earlier, I hope I clarified it in the discussion there. You're going to move from an on-premise database system and now you're moving into a cloud. Okay, so what happens to those existing databases? What do you do with them? Okay, and as I explained in an example of a scenario, if you have a scenario where you are going to start from a greenfields approach on cloud with S4HANA and you were on ECC, then in many cases, organizations decide to take that ECC and make it, as an example, as a legacy system. In the old days, we used to be moving off different applications, maybe a mainframe, another type of ERP, you may be moving off some other organization's ERP and you're moving to SAP. That old existing ERP became your legacy system. And you had to maintain a certain set. If you didn't bring all the data across, if there was a data residue sitting there, you had to maintain that. And that's why I say it's very important to understand that there's not just one single cost involved. In some of the projects that I've been involved in, of course, where we're doing greenfields SAP implementations, of course, there's always a legacy system. In this case, it may actually be that SAP is your legacy system. So when you're moving to RISE, I would almost say 90% of the times, it's your legacy system. So that you need to consider how you're going to maintain that and what's the migration costs of that. How are you going to migrate those costs? Okay. So yeah, so definitely there is a recording of this. The session and the slides will be presented later. And if you need any information, please, as I say, I'm going to go into that now. We at VOQUZ Labs have two different services to help organizations with this. So we have a user license simulation. So if you want to quickly and very fast understand really the changes from an ECC and even from an S4HANA to get into understanding what your RISE costing is, okay, on an FUE side, we can do that. So that's really easy. We can model it for you. We can say, hey, here's exactly the number of user licenses. We use our SAMQ technology. It's a software asset management tool. So we can simulate your S4HANA license simulation. So you want to determine whether you should stay on S4HANA, not necessarily go onto the RISE with the FUE construct, versus whether you want to actually stay in that space. We can do the simulation for you, okay? You're still maybe using ECC. Let's simulate it for you. Then you have a very clear and detailed optimization of your user licenses. And in most cases, remember I've showed you some graphical representations, your user license construct can make up to 70% of the cost of your current contract. So I would definitely, if I'm sitting as the SAP application manager, as the CIO in an organization, and I have one element in my bill of material, the named users, that equates to potentially 50 to 70% of my license construct cost, I would want to optimize that and I would want to simulate to get the right determination of the correct licensing for S4HANA. Okay, so this is one service we offer organizations. It's a quick, easy service. And this is some of the examples of what comes out of that. As you can see here, we get the user measurement in SAP. We optimize that, and this is just on a small number of users. Okay, and then we can actually say if you were on S4HANA or even on ECC, we can tell you what the optimized full user equivalent was based on conversion factors that we've built into the tool. And here you can see exactly, you're moving from 1,117 users. We optimize that down to 952. Your split from an FUE perspective looks at the following. So having 24 developers, you're going to have some more developers. You're going to have 220 cloud advanced users, core users, and self-service users down to 326 here. So this is the FUE equivalence. Okay, so we've done those calculations. It's available in our tool, and it makes it much simpler for you to try and determine this. Okay. The second option is we can also do a proposal evaluation with you as an organization. So this is where we actually take the SAP proposal, we look at the prices, the tier discounts, we evaluate the FUE calculations, we do recommendations about the infrastructure sizing, and then we put a recommendations down for the RISE with SAP contract. So this really helps you to maximize the value that you're going to get from the negotiation. So two different options from you. It depends on where you're at within your determination to go towards RISE. But we have built-in service proposals for organizations, and we're doing this with different companies around helping them determine whether RISE is the right option to go for. Okay, so these are two different elements. If you want to understand more about where these fit in, I'll share that with you shortly to our advisories. Okay, there's a question there around the FUEs. Yes, we'll send out the presentation. Let me go back one slide around FUEs. So for those of you who are not aware of FUEs, there is a conversion factor. It's a full user equivalence. So what you need to do is you need to take the existing value of licensing, and what SAP does is they say from a costing perspective, you need to purchase a certain package size of full user equivalence. So SAP sells it as a package, okay? And they say within that package you get 300, 150, whatever it is, and you can then do a split against what you see from an organization perspective is the most optimal way of splitting out that full user equivalent license. Let's call it a bucket. Okay, so you get one bucket of FUEs and you split it in multiple ways. What does this do? In essence, this actually ensures that you actually can restructure the user licenses according to the requirements that you have from a business perspective. Okay, in the past, you didn't have that flexibility. So SAP have said, okay, we want to add additional flexibility into the way in which you can structure the construct of named user licenses. It's called a full user equivalence construct. So that allows you to maybe to amend this. You might say, no, I don't want 24 developers, I only want 10. That means that in my bucket, I've now got the equivalent of an additional, okay, because it's a much lower construct or conversion factor is much stronger. I've got more advanced users that I can then plug in there. If I take 14 away from here, I can go and add an additional 28 advanced users in here. I could go and take that 14 times it by 5 and add in additional number of core users. And if I take that 14 times it by 30, I can add in self-service users. So that's the conversion factor here. Okay, so that's what's important about this construct of FUEs. And you need to first of all determine, as I said, you need to determine first of all what you're measuring in SAP. You then need to optimize it. I can't stress this enough. Optimization is critical. If you just take the current allocation of users in your system and you just convert it, you're doing a like for like without optimization, you're not going to save any money. You might actually increase the amount of money that you pay to SAP. Remember those slides earlier I showed you that might be costing you less at the start, but in the long run, it's going to cost you more. So that's what the full user equivalent context does. Okay, so I hope that explains it to you and gives you some explanation around FUEs. So we do this evaluation of the FUE calculation. We put it through the tool on the SAP tool and we run it, and it's much easier. You get a very clear, optimized and analyzed FUE calculation at the end of the system, at the service. Okay. This fits into our overall advisory service portfolio. You'll see here that we do these two here. This one, just to give you context, this one is a smaller one. So the RISE with user license simulation is a smaller element of our overall RISE with SAP proposal evaluation. You can do a little small simulation if you want. It's quick and easy. Otherwise, we will normally, if you actually build this in and you build the entire RISE with SAP evaluation, this comes part of it. So just to give you some different context, and then as I said here, we have a whole lot of other processes in here. People ask us, can we do digital access? Yes, we do the evaluation estimation. Again, a small little check for you just to show you how many documents you are creating in your system. And then we can add this if necessary to a full digital access risk evaluation, licenses, user optimization, etc. So we can do the contract review, etc. So this is part of one package part that comes into the license construct. Okay, so when customers ask us, how do we move forward? So you have different options here. We have a lot of different elements that we can do for you in this context. And I'm going to leave the slide up. I just want to see there's another question there. Okay, thanks for that. Yeah, there's another question above that. What is the experience with additional FUEs throughout the contract length and fixed rates? Yeah, when you let me just decompose this quickly. With regards to your FUEs, remember that the FUE, in terms of the contract that you decide on, you can, of course, you can increase those FUEs. You can buy more buckets or buy additional FUEs and then do additional splits and things like that. My take on this is that if you do your analysis properly and we actually look at your business model and we look at the future, as far into the future as possible, like a 3 to 5 year scenario down the line, and we say, okay, how much would you actually need? Then you can rather go into the negotiation, buy that which you need, and have it stabilized on a fixed price for that period of the contract. And then by doing it that way, you will have a stabilized, standardized FUE value in your contract that you can work according to from a budget perspective. That to me is a better way of doing it, and I hope that answers the question. So that's the way I would go about it. I would certainly take what you have as existing. So look at the legacy case. Maybe just you put the question away and just go up 2 slides. Back to the FUE slide here. In this case, I would definitely take into consideration the existing user measurements. I would optimize that, and then I would look into the future demand and say, is your business growing? Are you potentially going to acquire other businesses? Are you going to expand your businesses into different regions where you may have additional individuals that are required to be on SAP? And what can we estimate that value to be? And then on that basis, do a determination of the right bucket of FUEs you need to purchase. And I think that then you can look at, and then we can look at the tier discountings and things like that and say, okay, you know what, if you're going to go down that road and you're going to have X amount more number of users in place over a period of time, and I'm using an increased value, then it makes sense for you then to have, this is the bucket size, and we get a better tier discounting perspective in place from your FUE's perspective. It may be that you're on the other side of that scale, and I'm thinking about it from another context, that you're reducing the number of employees. You may be automating certain processes, etc. You may be having to downscale for various reasons in your business. Okay, then definitely I would say that you need to look at this. Look, we have only 2 minutes to go. I want to say thank you also very much for yeah, so in that case, I hope I answered your question around additional acquisitions and buying out new businesses and therefore the need for new additional FUEs. In that case, definitely let's simulate that. Let's put it into a simulation. We do have a simulation engine. So in the tool situation, we can simulate and say, okay, but wait a second, we're going to add some additional users in and let's simulate the outcome. That's one of the real great benefits of the SAMQ tool is the simulation approach that you can do. You can simulate future scenarios, changes in your business without impacting the current structure that you have. So, hey, I want to change something. If I simulate, what will be my outcome? What will be the cost implications? So that we can certainly do. Good. I hope this has been a really informative session. I'd like to say to everybody who's attended, thank you for your attendance today. If you're interested, please reach out to me. We want to make sure that you have the best outcome in your RISE negotiation. I mean, that's the fundamental what we work with. We help organizations across the globe with their negotiations to gain the best financial outcome in the contracting space with SAP. So reach out to us, info@voquzlabs.com. Please get in touch with us. I am on LinkedIn. Send me a message if you need to. We'd love to get in touch with you. And if you've got any further questions, please also be aware the session is recorded. We will send out the slide deck. It is available on our website. All our previous recordings are there. Have a look out for us. We have a new a set of additional webinars coming up. Look out for the BTP one. I'm really going to be excited about running that and helping organizations understand that. And yeah, I want to thank you very much for your time today. And let's just see if there's one last question in here. If not, we can close out the webinar. As I said, I'll answer all questions and get back to you on those questions. And just want to say thank you very much for your attendance today. Just go to, if there's one last question here. Okay. Okay, so yes, SAP may have come up with a program, but I know one thing about SAP, they have not come up with a program that optimizes your licenses. So definitely that's something that we'll look at. We can compare the SAP simulation. Look, just one thing about what we do from a tooling perspective, we do a lot of comparisons for companies around even digital access. We compare the SAP Passport with our structure, and we show you that in some cases SAP Passport's counting treble the documents. It's not to be trusted in some cases because it's doing double and triple counts. Rather look at it from this another perspective where we do a document count on the tables. So let's just be aware of that. Yeah, please, let's reach out if you want to have a one-on-one with me around those Z programs for FE calculations. Please, let's reach out. I'd love to see that. I'll have a look at with our technical team around this Z program that SAP gives, and we can compare the results. I'd love to see how that is comparable, and appreciate your input from that. Everybody, we're over time slightly. I want to say thank you again for your time today. Thank you for the attendance, and I wish you a very successful day further.